May 17, 1954, 11:47 a.m. Miller's Diner on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, Harlem, New York. On the same day that Chief Justice Earl Warren read the United States Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Brown v. Board of Education declaring that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal and violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection, 48-year-old Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson walked through the front door of Miller's Diner, wearing a three-piece charcoal suit tailored on Fifth Avenue, and carrying a leather briefcase that contains documents that would transform not just one segregated restaurant, but the entire landscape of public accommodations in Harlem. For the next 2 decades, Miller's Diner had operated at the same location since 1927, serving breakfast and lunch to a clientele that owner Harold Miller insisted must be separated by race, with white customers seated at the counter and in the main dining area, while black customers were directed to a separate section in the back, near the kitchen and bathrooms. Arrangement that violated no federal law because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had not yet been passed, and New York State's anti-discrimination statutes were rarely enforced and even more rarely challenged in court. The Supreme Court's decision in Brown had been announced at 12:52 p.m. Eastern Time, which meant that when Bumpy Johnson walked into Miller's Diner at 11:47 a.m., he did not yet know that the legal landscape of American segregation had shifted dramatically, though he would learn this information within the hour and would recognize immediately how to weaponize that decision in service of a campaign he had been planning for 6 months to desegregate every restaurant in Harlem through a combination of economic pressure, legal challenges, community organizing, and strategic property acquisition that would make it financially impossible for white-owned businesses to continue discriminating against the black customers who constituted the majority of Harlem's population. Miller's Diner was the first target in this campaign, not because it was the most segregated restaurant in Harlem, but because Harold Miller was the most vocal and unapologetic defender of segregation, a 57-year-old man from Mississippi who had brought Southern racial attitudes north and implemented them through a system of separate seating that he defended in newspaper interviews as his right as a private business owner to serve customers according to whatever standards he chose. When Bumpy Johnson walked through the front door and approached the main counter where white customers sat on red vinyl stools, eating eggs and bacon and drinking coffee from ceramic mugs, Harold Miller, who was working the register, looked up and said with the automatic condescension that characterized his interactions with black people, "Colored section is in the back." "You know that, boy. Don't make me have to tell you twice." This was exactly the response Johnson had anticipated, and precisely the opening he needed to execute the strategy he had spent 6 months developing with a team that included 3 lawyers, 2 accountants, 1 real estate appraiser, and 17 community organizers who had been conducting surveys and gathering evidence about discrimination practices at 27 restaurants across Harlem. Johnson did not move toward the back section, did not acknowledge Miller's directive, instead opened his briefcase and removed a document that he placed on the counter in front of Miller and said, "I'm not here to eat, Mr. Miller. I'm here to inform you that as of this morning you have exactly 30 days to either integrate this establishment or accept my purchase offer of $47,000 for the property and business, which is approximately $12,000 above current market value based on an independent appraisal I commissioned last month." Harold Miller stared at the document, then at Johnson, then back at the document, processing what he had just heard with the kind of confusion that comes from having expectations violated so completely that reality requires several seconds to register. The purchase offer was typed on legal letterhead from Morrison and Associates, one of Harlem's most prestigious black-owned law firms, and it included detailed financial breakdowns of the property's value, the business's annual revenue, projected losses if the establishment faced organized boycotts, and a timeline for closing that gave Miller 30 days to respond. Miller picked up the document, read the first page, then the second, then looked at Johnson and said, "You think you can walk in here and buy my business? You think I'm going to sell to some colored gangster just because you wave money around? I built this place from nothing, and I'll run it how I see fit until the day I die." This response was also anticipated, which was why Johnson's strategy included multiple pressure points that would be activated simultaneously. over the next 30 days to create a situation where selling to Johnson would become Miller's least painful option. The first pressure point was legal, and it would be triggered within 3 hours, when Morrison and Associates filed a civil rights complaint with New York State's Commission Against Discrimination, alleging that Miller's Diner had systematically violated state NTD laws through its segregated seating policy and requesting immediate injunctive relief. The second pressure point was economic, and it would begin the following morning when 17 community organizers started a coordinated campaign to inform every black resident within a 10-block radius of Miller's Diner that the establishment discriminated against black customers, and that patronizing integrated restaurants was both a moral imperative and a practical way to support businesses that respected their dignity. The third pressure point was social, and it would manifest through Bumpy Johnson's extensive network of relationships with other business owners, union leaders, suppliers, and city officials who could make Harold Miller's life incrementally more difficult through delayed deliveries, failed health inspections, increased police attention to minor code violations, and withdrawal of informal support that every business relies on to operate smoothly in a complex urban environment. If you've ever watched someone use economic power and legal pressure to force social change without throwing a single punch, subscribe and comment below about times when strategic planning defeated entrenched discrimination through methods that couldn't be ignored or dismissed as criminal violence. Because what Bumpy Johnson did over the next 30 days would demonstrate that power in Harlem was not just about controlling illegal gambling and drug distribution, but about understanding how to weaponize capitalism itself to destroy segregation by making discrimination economically unsustainable. The fourth pressure point was political, and it would be deployed through Johnson's connections to Harlem's elected representatives who were already preparing statements celebrating the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board decision, and who could be persuaded to publicly denounce local businesses that continued practicing segregation in defiance of the moral principles that the Supreme Court had just affirmed at the national level. The fifth pressure point was media coverage, and it would come from black newspapers, including the Amsterdam News and the New York Age, which had been covering discrimination in Harlem's restaurants for years, and which would enthusiastically report on Bumpy Johnson's campaign to desegregate Miller's Diner, if that campaign could be framed as civil rights activism rather than criminal enterprise. The combination of these 5 pressure points operating simultaneously was designed to create a crisis that Miller could only resolve through one of 2 paths: integrate voluntarily and lose the white customers who preferred segregated dining, or sell to Johnson and walk away with a profit that exceeded what he could reasonably expect to make if he fought the inevitable transformation of Harlem's commercial landscape. Harold Miller did not understand any of this yet, standing behind his counter reading the purchase offer and assuming that he could reject it and return to business as usual, protected by property rights and the assumption that one black man, regardless of his criminal reputation, could not force a white business owner to change practices that had been standard for decades. What Miller failed to understand was that Bumpy Johnson was not operating alone, but rather coordinating a campaign involving dozens of people and multiple organizations, all working toward the shared goal of making segregation so expensive and so legally vulnerable and so publicly shameful that maintaining it would require sacrifices that white business owners were unwilling to make when easier alternatives existed. The purchase offer was not a threat in the traditional sense of violence or extortion, but rather a strategic option that became more attractive. With each passing day as the other 4 pressure points increased, Miller's operating costs damaged his reputation, reduced his customer base, and created legal liabilities that his insurance would not cover. At 1:15 p.m. that afternoon, 4 hours after Bumpy Johnson walked out of Miller's Diner, leaving Harold Miller holding the purchase offer, news of the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board decision reached Harlem through radio broadcasts and afternoon newspapers, and the black community erupted in celebration, with spontaneous gatherings forming on street corners and in churches and in barber shops where people discussed what this decision meant for their children and grandchildren and for the future of racial justice in America. Johnson understood immediately that the timing was perfect, that the moral authority of the Supreme Court's decision would amplify his campaign against Miller's Diner by establishing a national consensus that separate was inherently unequal, that segregation violated fundamental American principles, that institutions clinging to discriminatory practices were on the wrong side of history and would eventually be forced to change either through legal pressure or social transformation. Within 6 hours of the Brown decision being announced, Morrison and Associates had filed their civil rights complaint and had scheduled a press conference for the following morning where they would announce that they were representing Harlem community members in a legal challenge against 27 restaurants, including Miller's Diner, that maintains segregated seating arrangements in violation of New York state law. The press conference would be attended by representatives from the NAAC, the Urban League, several Harlem churches, and 3 city council members who represented Harlem districts, creating a coalition that framed the fight against restaurant segregation as part of the broader civil rights movement that had just won its most significant legal victory at the Supreme Court. The strategic brilliance of Johnson's timing was that Harold Miller and the other 26 restaurant owners he was targeting would face this legal and political challenge at precisely the moment when defending segregation had become morally indefensible in the wake of Brown, when the national conversation had shifted decisively toward integration, when continuing to operate segregated facilities would mark business owners as defenders of a system that the Supreme Court had just declared unconstitutional in the context of education, and that civil rights activists were determined to destroy in every other context, including public accommodations. The boycott of Miller's Diner began on May 19, 1954, 2 days after the Brown decision and 3 days after Johnson's visit, and it was organized with military precision by 17 community activists who had been trained in nonviolent direct action and who understood that successful boycotts required not just asking black customers to stay away, but providing them with attractive alternatives that met their needs while supporting the political goals of integration. The organizers had identified 4 integrated restaurants within 2 blocks of Miller's Diner where black customers were welcomed and served without discrimination, and they stood on corners, distributing flyers that listed these alternatives, explained the moral imperative of refusing to patronize segregated establishments, and connected the local fight against Miller's Diner to the national victory represented by Brown v. Board of Education. Within 3 days, Miller's black customer base had declined by 80%, and because black customers had constituted approximately 60% of his total revenue despite being relegated to inferior seating, Miller was suddenly operating at a significant loss. The health inspection occurred on May 23, exactly 1 week after Johnson's initial visit, and while the violations discovered by city inspectors were technically minor and ordinarily would have resulted in warnings rather than citations, the combination of multiple small violations created a pattern that justified temporary closure until corrections were made and reinspection was completed. The violations included improper food storage temperatures, inadequate ventilation in the kitchen, cracked floor tiles that could harbor bacteria, and insufficient cleaning of food preparation surfaces, none of which had changed since the last inspection 6 months earlier, but all of which were documented with photographs and detailed reports that would require Miller to hire contractors and make repairs that would cost approximately $6,000 and keep his restaurant closed for at least 10 days. The timing of this inspection was not coincidental, and while no direct evidence existed that Bumpy Johnson had influenced the inspector's decision to conduct a thorough examination of Miller's Diner at this particular moment, everyone involved understood that Johnson's network extended into city government, and that health inspectors who wanted to maintain good relationships with Harlem's most powerful figure would be responsive to subtle suggestions about which establishments deserved extra scrutiny. The media coverage began on May 25, when the Amsterdam News published a front-page story about the campaign to desegregate Harlem's restaurants, featuring photographs of Miller's Diner with its separate colored section, and quotes from community members describing the humiliation of being directed to inferior seating while white customers enjoyed the main dining area. The story connected Miller's segregation practices to the broader struggle for civil rights, citing the Brown decision as evidence that separate facilities were inherently unequal and arguing that New York State had a moral and legal obligation to enforce its anti-discrimination laws against businesses that continued practicing segregation. Harold Miller was quoted defending his right to run his business according to his own standards, but his comments made him sound reactionary and out of touch with the changing moral landscape of American race relations. And the article generated dozens of letters to the editor supporting the boycott and calling for Miller to either integrate or sell. Have you ever watched economic pressure and legal challenges combine to make discrimination financially impossible regardless of the business owner's personal beliefs? If you've seen strategic activism transform entire industries by making segregation more expensive than integration, hit like and subscribe, because what happened to Harold Miller over the next 2 weeks would become a template for desegregating hundreds of businesses across northern cities. The suppliers began experiencing delivery problems on May 27th, with trucks arriving late or not at all, with orders being partially fulfilled or incorrectly filled, with prices mysteriously increasing for reasons that were never quite explained, but that made Miller's operating costs rise by approximately 20%. The suppliers claimed these problems were coincidental, blamed them on labor disputes and supply chain disruptions and administrative errors. But the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Businesses that supplied Miller's diner were being encouraged through various informal channels to make his life difficult. And while no one could prove that Bumpy Johnson was behind these disruptions, no one needed proof because everyone understood how power operated in Harlem and how vendors who wanted to maintain good relationships with Johnson's organization would be responsive to suggestions about which customers deserved premium service and which customers could be made to wait. On June 15, days after Bumpy Johnson's initial visit and 14 days into the boycott, Harold Miller's attorney contacted Morrison & Associates to discuss a potential settlement of the discrimination complaint. Miller was not yet ready to sell, still believed he could weather this storm and return to business as usual once the publicity died down and the boycotts lost momentum, but he was willing to discuss integrating his seating arrangements if that would resolve the legal challenges and restore his customer base. The settlement negotiations lasted 8 days and revealed Miller's fundamental miscalculation about what was happening, which was that Johnson's campaign was not primarily about integrating Miller's diner, but rather about acquiring it as part of a larger strategy to gain control of commercial real estate along 125th Street that would appreciate dramatically in value over the next 2 decades as Harlem's economy grew and transformed. Johnson attended the settlement meeting personally on June 9th, accompanied by his attorney and his accountant, and he listened to Harold Miller's attorney propose a settlement where Miller would remove the segregated seating, post signs declaring that all customers were welcome regardless of race, and pay a modest fine to the State Discrimination Commission. Johnson waited until the attorney finished speaking, and then said, "That settlement would have been acceptable 2 weeks ago, but circumstances have changed. Mr. Miller has lost 63% of his customer base. His operating costs have increased by 22%. He's carrying $6,000 in repair costs from the health inspection, and his business is currently losing approximately $1,800 per week, which means he'll be bankrupt in approximately 14 weeks if current trends continue. My revised offer is $39,000 for the property and business, which is $8,000 less than my original offer, but still approximately $4,000 above what you could reasonably expect to get from any other buyer, given the business's current financial condition." This revised offer crystallized Miller's situation in a way that his attorney could not ignore. The boycott was not temporary. The increased costs were not accidental. The legal challenges were not going away. And the only question was whether Miller would sell now for a reasonable profit or wait until his business collapsed entirely and sell later for a fraction of what Johnson was offering. Miller tried to negotiate, argued that the business would recover once he integrated, insisted that Johnson was artificially suppressing the value through coordinated pressure, but Johnson simply restated his offer and gave Miller 72 hours to decide before the offer would be reduced again to reflect the continuing losses that Miller would accumulate. During those 3 days, Harold Miller sold Miller's Diner to Bumpy Johnson on June 14, 1954, exactly 28 days after Johnson's initial visit and 1 day before Johnson's revised offer would have been reduced further. The purchase price was $39,000. The business was transferred free and clear of all debts and obligations, and Miller signed a non-compete agreement preventing him from opening another restaurant in Harlem for 5 years. Within 3 days of the sale being finalized, Johnson had renovated the interior, removed all signs indicating separate seating areas, hired an integrated staff, changed the name to Lennox Diner, and reopened with a grand celebration attended by hundreds of Harlem residents who had participated in the boycott and who now flooded back to patronize a business that welcomed all customers with equal dignity. If you were as impressed as Harlem's residents by this demonstration of how economic power could transform segregated institutions without violence, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments whether you've ever participated in boycotts that forced businesses to change discriminatory practices, because what Bumpy Johnson did at Miller's Diner was just the beginning of a campaign that would reshape Harlem's entire commercial landscape. The template Johnson established at Miller's Diner was then applied systematically to the other 26 restaurants that had been targeted in the original discrimination complaint. Johnson offered to purchase each establishment, gave owners 30 days to either integrate or accept his offer, coordinated boycotts and legal challenges and inspections and supplier disruptions that made segregation economically unsustainable, and systematically acquired properties from owners who chose to sell rather than fight an opponent who controlled too many pressure points and who had too much capital and too many connections, and to clear a strategic vision about how to transform Harlem's commercial real estate market. Over the next 18 months, Johnson acquired 17 of the 27 targeted restaurants, forcing the other 10 to integrate through boycotts and legal pressure that made discrimination too expensive to maintain, even for owners who refused to sell. The long-term impact of this campaign extended far beyond the desegregation of Harlem's restaurants, though that achievement alone was significant. By acquiring 17 commercial properties along Harlem's main commercial corridors, Johnson positioned himself to benefit from the neighborhood's economic revitalization over the next 2 decades as black businesses flourished and property values increased and Harlem transformed from a community defined by discrimination and poverty into a center of black economic and cultural power. The restaurants Johnson acquired were converted into integrated businesses that employed black managers and staff, served all customers equally, and became gathering spaces where Harlem's residents could eat and socialize without experiencing the humiliation of segregated seating or inferior service. Several of these establishments became landmarks, places where civil rights activists met to plan strategies, where black professionals conducted business, where families celebrated important occasions in environments that affirmed their dignity and worth. The strategic brilliance of Johnson's campaign was recognized by civil rights organizations that were fighting segregation in other northern cities, and activists from Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Cleveland came to Harlem to study Johnson's methods and adapt them to their own contexts. The combination of boycotts, legal challenges, media coverage, and strategic property acquisition became a template for transforming segregated commercial districts across the urban North, demonstrating that even without the legal clarity that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would eventually provide, determined activists could make discrimination economically unsustainable through coordinated pressure and strategic investment. Johnson shared his tactics freely with these activists, recognizing that his personal profit from acquiring Harlem real estate was compatible with the broader goal of desegregating American public accommodations, that his criminal reputation did not prevent him from contributing meaningfully to the civil rights movement, that power gained through illegal means could be deployed for legitimate ends. Subscribe for more stories about how economic power and strategic planning transformed segregated institutions when legal protections were insufficient, and when activism required more than just moral appeals. Comment below if you've learned about other examples of using capitalism to destroy discrimination. The transformation of Miller's Diner into Lennox Diner became a symbol of what was possible when economic leverage was applied systematically to segregated institutions, when boycotts were sustained by providing attractive alternatives, when legal challenges were backed by resources sufficient to outlast opponents, when media coverage framed business conflicts as civil rights struggles, when political support from elected officials created additional pressure on discriminatory establishments. The success of this campaign demonstrated that Bumpy Johnson was not just a criminal who controlled illegal gambling and drug distribution, but a strategic thinker who understood how to weaponize economic power in service of social transformation, who recognized that Harlem's restaurants would create long-term value both for the community and for his own investment portfolio, who saw no contradiction between personal profit and collective liberation because both goals could be achieved through the same tactics of strategic property acquisition and coordinated pressure. The other restaurant owners who sold to Johnson during this 80-month campaign made similar calculations as Harold Miller. Continuing to fight meant accumulating losses, facing legal challenges, enduring boycotts, experiencing supplier problems, and watching their businesses deteriorate while Johnson offered prices that were reasonable given market conditions, and that provided dignified exits from situations that had become untenable. Some owners integrated rather than selling, discovered that serving black customers with dignity did not destroy their businesses, but rather expanded their customer base and improved their reputations in a neighborhood where black residents controlled significant purchasing power. These owners avoided Johnson's acquisition campaign, but still contributed to the broader transformation of Harlem's commercial landscape by demonstrating that integration was not just morally correct, but economically viable, that serving all customers equally created sustainable businesses that thrived rather than failed. By 1956, 2 years after Bumpy Johnson walked into Miller's diner with his purchase offer, segregated seating in Harlem restaurants had effectively disappeared. Not because federal law prohibited it, but because Johnson's campaign had made discrimination economically impossible and socially unacceptable. The restaurants he acquired had become successful integrated businesses. The restaurants that remained independent had adopted integration to avoid becoming targets of his campaign, and Harlem's commercial corridors had transformed into spaces where black residents could patronize any establishment without fear of being relegated to inferior sections or refuse service entirely. This transformation occurred 8 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would formally prohibit discrimination in public accommodations nationwide, demonstrating that social change could be achieved through economic pressure and strategic activism even when legal protections were absent or uninformed. The legacy of what Johnson did at Miller's Diner extended through the decades that followed, influencing how civil rights organizations thought about economic power, how black business owners understood the importance of controlling commercial real estate, how communities recognized that boycotts required not just moral appeals, but concrete alternatives and sustained coordination. The buildings that Johnson acquired appreciated dramatically in value, making his estate worth millions when he died in 1968. And many of those properties remained black-owned and operated for generations, serving as foundations for family wealth and community institutions. The strategy he pioneered of using economic leverage to force institutional change became a standard tool in civil rights campaigns, adapted and refined by activists who recognized that capitalism could be weaponized against discrimination by making segregation more expensive than integration. And when people in Harlem told stories about Bumpy Johnson in the years and decades after his death, they told stories not just about his control of illegal gambling or his conflicts with rival gangsters, but about the day he walked into a whites-only diner carrying a purchase offer and transformed that single establishment into a symbol of how economic power could destroy segregation, how strategic planning could outmaneuver entrenched discrimination, how one determined person with sufficient resources and clear vision could change an entire neighborhood's commercial landscape by making integration inevitable rather than optional, profitable rather than costly, the natural evolution of capitalism rather than a moral burden imposed by activists. That story became part of Harlem's collective memory, told and retold in barbershops and churches and family gatherings, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories in the fight for civil rights came not from courts or legislatures but from strategic activists who understood how to weaponize economics itself in service of social transformation.